The rain had stopped just before midnight, leaving the city slick and silent under a sky the color of wet charcoal. I was walking home from the late shift at the copy shop, my footsteps the only sound echoing in the canyon of closed office buildings. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete, a clean, cold smell that usually I found refreshing. But that night, it just felt empty. My route was a series of islands of light, each street lamp casting a perfect, stark circle on the glistening pavement, with long stretches of oppressive darkness between them. I was in that headspace of pure routine, body on autopilot, mind numb with the drone of the day. I remember glancing at my watch, 12:17 a.m., and thinking only of my bed. I approached one of these islands of light, my shadow stretching out long and thin behind me, a familiar companion. As I stepped into the direct glow under the lamp, the light so bright it made the raindrops on my jacket sparkle, I felt the oddest sensation. It wasn't a sound or a touch, but a shift, like a change in pressure in my ears, or the moment after a loud noise stops. I took another step, fully into the center of the light, and then I walked out of the other side, my eyes already adjusting to the deeper gloom of the next stretch of street. It was only after 3 more paces that I felt a chill, a literal cold spot on the back of my neck, as if I'd left a part of myself in the warmth of that lamp. I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. It was an instinct, a primal tug in my gut. I turned around slowly, my shoes scraping softly on the damp asphalt. And there, under the street lamp I had just passed through, lay my shadow. It wasn't stretching toward me. It wasn't attached to my feet. It was just there, a flat, black, two-dimensional cutout of me, lying perfectly within the circle of light, as if it had been painted onto the ground. It was in the exact posture I had been in the moment I entered the light, mid-stride, 1 foot slightly raised. My head tilted down just as it had been when I looked at my watch. It was perfectly, horribly still. My breath hitched in my throat, a small, dry sound. I took an involuntary step back, and my own feet, still firmly attached to my body, cast a new, trembling shadow that shrank and grew with my movement. But the one under the lamp didn't budge. It remained. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring. A car turned onto the far end of the street, its headlights sweeping the scene. For a second, I was terrified the driver would see it, would see this impossible thing and know something was wrong with me. But the car sped past, its lights washing over the pavement, and the shadow under the lamp didn't change, didn't waver. It existed independently of any new light source. It was just a part of the ground now. Logic, brittle and desperate, tried to assert itself. A trick of the light. An oil stain. My tired eyes. I had to be mistaken. I forced myself to walk back toward the lamp, each step heavier than the last. As I re-entered the circle of light, I expected my shadow to somehow snap back to me, to rejoin like a magnet clicking into place. It didn't. I stood right over it. I was standing on my own shadow. The feeling was indescribable, a profound, gut-churning vertigo. I looked down at this black silhouette beneath my shoes. It was mine. I could see the details, the frayed edge of my jacket hood, the specific way my bag strap fell across my chest. It was a perfect negative of me, but it was cold. The air directly above it was noticeably colder, a pocket of winter in the damp spring night. I knelt down, against every screaming instinct, and reached a shaking hand toward it. I didn't expect to touch anything. It was a shadow. But as my fingers got within an inch of its outline, a numbness spread through them, a deep, bone-ache cold. And I felt a pull. Not a physical yank, but a suction, a draining sensation, as if that patch of darkness was a void and my vitality was a thin mist being drawn toward it. I snatched my hand back, stumbling to my feet and scrambling out of the light. I stood panting in the dark, 10 feet away, staring at the scene. A man and his shadow, separated by a gulf of unnatural physics. I couldn't leave it. The thought was immediate and absolute. The idea of just walking away, of going home to my apartment and trying to sleep while this piece of me lay abandoned on a public street, was unthinkable. It felt like leaving a vital organ on the sidewalk. So I waited. I stood in the darkness just outside the pool of light, a silent sentinel to my own anomaly. The city slept on. Another hour bled away. I watched the shadow, and it never moved, not even a flicker when a breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, dappling the light. It was immune to the world. It only obeyed the rule of its own existence. Eventually, driven by a madness born of exhaustion and terror, I tried to communicate. My voice was a rusted hinge. "Hello?" I whispered to the shadow. Nothing. "Get up." Silence. I pleaded. I commanded. I even, in a moment of sheer desperation, stepped back into the light and tried to mimic its exact pose, hoping for a symmetry that would trigger a reunion. I stood frozen in that mid-stride stance for minutes, my muscles burning, feeling like the world's most pathetic statue. The shadow remained indifferent. It was complete without me. The first hint of dawn began as a graying of the eastern sky, a dilution of the black. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. What happens to a shadow when the sun rises? When the specific light source that created it is replaced by a diffuse, all-consuming glow? As the sky lightened from charcoal to a deep blue, the street lamp's electric glow began to look sickly and weak. The circle of light grew less distinct. And my shadow, it began to fade. Not like a normal shadow, softening at the edges. It faded like a photograph left in the sun, its inky blackness turning to a murky gray, its sharp edges blurring. It was dissolving with the night. I couldn't let it. I acted without thought. I ran to the nearby alley and found a discarded piece of cardboard, a flat sheet from a packing box. I ran back, and with a sense of sacrilege, I slid the cardboard under the edge of the fading shadow and tried to scoop it up, to preserve it. The moment the cardboard passed through its form, the shadow's remaining contrast vanished entirely. It didn't transfer to the cardboard. It just dissipated. It was gone. The street lamp clicked off as the dawn finally asserted itself. I was left kneeling on the wet pavement, holding a soggy piece of cardboard, completely, utterly alone. I went home. I showered. I called in sick. I lay in my bed with the curtains drawn, in a darkness I had once found comforting. But now, the darkness felt different. It felt attentive. I slept in fits and starts, and my dreams were soundless and two-dimensional, landscapes of flat black and white where I moved without feeling. When I woke, it was evening again. The room was thick with twilight. I sat on the edge of my bed, and my eyes drifted to the wall opposite my window, where the last of the sunset should have been casting the silhouette of my window frame, and my own shape sitting slumped. The wall was blank. There was no shadow. Not from the window, not from the chair, not from me. I waved my hand in front of the dim light. Nothing. I stood up, my heart a dull, heavy drum in my chest. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the blinding overhead light. I looked at the floor, at the walls. I was surrounded by light, but I cast no darkness. The light fell on me and passed through, as if I had become transparent to it, or as if I had no substance left to interrupt its path. That was a week ago. I've lost track of the days. I don't sleep anymore, not really. I exist in a state of permanent, twilight watchfulness. I've become a creature of the day, because the night is now a mirror that shows me my lack. But the day is no comfort either. People don't look at me twice, but I see their eyes slide over me a little too easily. Conversations feel strained, as if I'm not fully there. My reflection in mirrors is wan, washed out, like a photograph copied too many times. And I am always, always cold. A deep, internal cold that no blanket or heater can touch. Last night, I went back. I stood under the same street lamp at the same time. The rain had returned, a fine, misty drizzle. I stood there for hours, hoping in some irrational corner of my soul that it would return, that my darkness would be waiting for me, ready to be taken back. The pavement was just pavement. Just wet concrete under harsh electric light. I was about to leave, the hope finally extinguished, when I saw it. Not my shadow. But as I stepped away, walking out of the light, I glanced back. And for a fraction of a second, I saw a different shape under the lamp. Not a flat silhouette, but a suggestion of depth, of solidity. A darkness that stood upright, in the exact space where I had been standing. It was there, and then it was gone, blinked away by the rain and the glare. But I know what I saw. It was no longer lying down. It was learning to stand. And somewhere, in the back of my mind where the cold is deepest, new and terrible thought is taking root. It wasn't just my shadow that I left behind. It was my capacity to cast one. And what grows in the light, when you are no longer there to define its shape? I sit now in my bright apartment, all the lights blazing, and I write this down. But the bulbs seem dimmer every hour, as if the light is tired of fighting. And in the corners of the room, where the light doesn't quite reach, the darkness doesn't just sit. It waits. It's learning my shape from the outside in. And I think, soon, it will be ready to come home. It began as these things often do with a simple annoyance. The apartment upstairs had a leak, a persistent drip from a corroded pipe in their bathroom that had seeped into my ceiling, creating a damp brown Rorschach blot over my bed. The landlord was a ghost, the neighbors were never home, and after a week of listening to the plink 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 into a saucepan at 3 in the morning, I took a wrench and went up to introduce myself. The door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning, but the silence from within and the spreading stain on my own ceiling pushed me forward. I called out a hesitant hello into the dim, stale-aired hallway. No answer, just the drip, louder now, coming from an open bathroom door at the end of the hall. Her name was Alara, she told me later. She was standing in the doorway of the living room as I emerged from the bathroom, having clumsily tightened a joint to stop the immediate leak. I startled, nearly dropping the wrench. She was pale, so pale her skin seemed to almost glow in the gray afternoon light filtering through dusty blinds. Her hair was a colorless blonde, hanging straight and fine. She was thin, wrapped in a faded gray sweater that seemed too large for her, but it was her eyes that held me. They were a light watery blue, and they held an expression not of surprise at finding a stranger in her home, but of a profound, weary resignation. She didn't ask what I was doing there, she just said, "It's the pipes, they're old," as if we were already in the middle of a conversation. I stammered an apology, explained about my ceiling. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting past me to the damp patch on her own bathroom floor. "It always finds a way through," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I offered to call a proper plumber to talk to the landlord for her. She just shook her head. "It won't help." There was a finality in her tone that closed the subject. Feeling awkward, I made to leave. As I passed her in the narrow hallway, I stepped between her and the window. The late sun shot a long beam across the worn carpet, and I saw my own shadow, elongated and distorted, stretch out before me, and I saw with a clarity that made my step falter that it fell over her, across her legs, her torso, her face, but it did not interact with her. It did not bend over the shape of her body. It simply continued on as if she were not there, as if she were a pane of clear glass. She had no shadow of her own. I convinced myself I was mistaken. The angle was wrong. The light was tricky. My eyes, tired from poor sleep under the dripping ceiling, were playing tricks. For days I tried to forget the tall, pale woman upstairs and the strange cold feeling that had settled in my stomach, but the silence from above was absolute. No footsteps, no music, no running water. It was as if the apartment were empty again. Yet I'd see her sometimes in the shared basement laundry room or checking her mailbox. She moved silently, a wisp of a person, and she never seemed to be in direct, strong light. The fluorescent bulbs in the basement cast a sickly, omnidirectional glow that left everyone's shadows faint and scattered. I'd glance, trying to be casual and see nothing definitive, but the doubt had taken root. Then one evening I was taking out the garbage. The sun had just set, and the security light at the back of our building had flickered on a single buzzing halogen lamp mounted high on the wall. It cast one sharp, deep shadow across the asphalt parking lot. I was wrestling with a split bag when I saw her emerge from the back door. She paused on the step, hugging herself against the chill, and there, thrown across the rough asphalt by the stark light, was my shadow, long and thin. From my position by the dumpster, it pointed directly at her. As she stepped forward, she walked into it. She walked into my shadow, and where her feet should have broken its form, where her body should have created a new silhouette, there was nothing. She was inside the outline of my darkness, her pale form a void within it, a Negative space. She stopped, turned her head and looked directly along the length of the shadow right to where I stood frozen. Her watery blue eyes met mine, and in them I saw not accusation but a kind of painful understanding. She knew that I saw. After that I became obsessed with light and its absence. I noticed things in the supermarket under the rows of bright LEDs, the carts and shelves and other shoppers all through chaotic overlapping shades on the polished floor. Elara pushing a nearly empty cart cast none. She was a hole in the latticework of darkness. At the bus stop on a sunny morning, people were anchored to their black doubles on the pavement. She stood slightly apart in the thin strip of shade offered by the shelter's roof, her form flat and textureless, absorbing light but creating no counterpart. She was always careful, always positioning herself in diffuse light or deep shade. It was a practiced unconscious dance, and I was the only one who seemed to notice my own shadow began to feel different. It felt borrowed. Thin I'd catch sight of it trailing behind me, and a jolt of unease would shoot through me. Was it mine? Was it as dense as it should be? In the privacy of my bathroom under the harsh vanity lights I would move my hands, watching the shadows pivot and shift, reassuring myself they were responsive, attached, but the reassurance was fleeting. The memory of her standing inside my shadow, a ghost in my personal darkness, haunted me. I finally spoke to her again. I concocted a lie about needing to check the repaired pipe, about the landlord finally returning my calls. She let me in without a word. Her apartment was sparse, almost barren, no photographs, few books, furniture that looked like it came with the place. It was clean, but it felt like a waiting room, a temporary space. The light was all wrong. She had heavy curtains drawn, and the only illumination came from a single low-wattage table lamp in the corner, draped with a cloth smothering its glow into a weak amber pool that reached only a few feet. The rest of the room swam in a deep velvety gloom. We stood in the awkward silence. The drip was gone. At least, I asked her, my voice too loud in the muffled space, if she was okay, if she needed anything. She looked at me for a long time. You see it, don't you? She said finally. No pretense. I could only nod. She sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on concrete. It's been a long time since anyone has. She didn't explain. She didn't tell a story of a curse or a childhood accident. She simply stated it as a fact, like having brown hair or being left-handed, but one that carried an unbearable weight. The light doesn't stick to me, she whispered. It goes through, impermeable to it. I didn't understand, not really, but I felt a terrible pity for her, a pity laced with a fear I couldn't name. I left her apartment, and the normal hallway light felt assaultive, violent. I rushed back to my own place, to the familiar shadows in the corners, clinging to them like old friends. That was the beginning of the transference. It started subtly. I'd wake up feeling drained, as if I hadn't slept, a coldness in my limbs that coffee couldn't shake. My own shadow, which I now watched with a paranoid vigilance, began to look less substantial. On a bright Saturday afternoon, walking in the park, I saw it pooling around my feet. It was the right shape, but it seemed faded, washed out, like ink running low in a pen. A man jogged past me, and his shadow was a solid, sharp-edged thing, a black stamp on the grass. Mine was a smudge. I began to avoid her, but the building was small. Our paths crossed each time. I felt a subtle pull, a drain. One night I had a dream. I was standing in a featureless white room, a room so bright it hurt. Elara was there across from me, and from my feet my shadow was stretching across the infinite white floor, not as a passive absence of light but as a living tendril of darkness slithering toward her. It reached her feet and began to climb her like ivy, like a stain, until she was clothed in my darkness, and I was left standing in the blinding whiteness, feeling transparent, feeling like I would evaporate. I woke up gasping, my room pitch black. I fumbled for the lamp. When it clicked on, I looked immediately at the wall. My shadow was there, thrown against the far wall, but it was faint, and for a heart-stopping second it seemed to be the wrong shape, taller, thinner. I blinked, and it was mine again. The line between my perception and reality was dissolving. The final moment was last evening. Another leak this time in the shared basement. A pipe had burst near the fuse box. The landlord, in a rare moment of responsibility, had propped a work light on a crate, a single powerful halogen bulb that cast a monstrous dark light, creating a cavern of sharp black and white in the cluttered space. Had knocked on both our doors for help moving boxes. I couldn't say no. She came down silently. We worked in the roar of the shop vac, moving soggy cardboard. The work light was the sun in that underground world. Our movements were a frantic puppet show of exaggerated darkness. My shadow leapt and danced across the cinderblock walls, a frantic giant. I kept glancing at her. She was trying to stay out of the direct beam, sticking to the periphery, but the space was too small, the light too dominant. As she bent to lift a box, she stumbled slightly and stepped fully into the light. Nothing happened. No shadow bloomed at her feet, but my own shadow, which was at that moment flung against a stack of old doors, jerked. It didn't follow My movement it simply twitched independently like a puppet. When one string is pulled I froze. Alara straightened up and her eyes wide with a terror I now shared met mine. Across the bright damp space she looked from me to the wall where my shadow was still splayed, a dark stain that seemed to be trembling at the edges. She took a step back out of the light into the softer gloom. My shadow on the wall settled, but it didn't look right. The proportions were off. The head was too small, the neck too long. The landlord shouted something about the circuit breaker and the moment broke. We finished the job in a thick silent dread. I fled upstairs. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair in my dark living room watching the sliver of light under my door from the hallway fixture. This morning I found a note slipped under my door. Her handwriting was spidery faint, as if written with the last drop of ink in a pen. I'm sorry. It's getting stronger. It needs an anchor. It's starting to. Prefer yours. I ran upstairs. Her door was ajar. The apartment was empty, truly empty this time. Not a piece of furniture, not a scrap of paper. It was as if no one had ever lived there. The heavy curtains were gone and the morning sun poured in, revealing only dust motes dancing in the beams. No shadow, no sign of her. I am back in my apartment now. The sun is high, casting clear strong light through my windows. I am sitting at my kitchen table, writing this, and I am watching with a cold still horror the shape that lies at my feet on the linoleum. It is my shadow. It has the general outline of a man sitting at a table, but the details are wrong. The shoulders are too narrow, the hair is too long, falling in a straight fine sheet. It is a hybrid, a grotesque amalgamation. It is no longer entirely mine, and when I move my hand to write, the shadow hand on the floor moves a half second later with a languid reluctant grace, as if it is learning a new set of strings. The light is so bright and I can feel it, a constant gentle suction, a slow siphon. I am waiting for dusk. I am waiting to see what happens when the room grows dark and the only thing left to define me is the thing on the floor that is no longer my own. The problem with insomnia isn't the exhaustion, it's the hyperclarity in the dead hours between 3 and 4 a.m. The world isn't just quiet, it's stripped bare. That's when I first truly noticed the texture of my own shadow. I'd given up on sleep and was sitting at the small table in my kitchen, the overhead light a single buzzing halogen bulb that cast a stark unforgiving circle on the worn linoleum. I was reading, or trying to, my eyes skimming the same paragraph about aggregate economic trends for the third time. My left leg was jiggling, a nervous habit, and I watched the shadow of my knee bounce rhythmically on the floor. Then I stopped the jiggling and my shadow didn't. It was a lag of maybe 2 full seconds. My knee was still, but the dark shape beneath it completed one last slow lazy bounce before settling. A trick of tired eyes, I told myself, a stutter in the synapses. I clenched my hand into a fist on the tabletop, then opened it on the floor. The shadow hand closed, opened, a perfect mimic. I breathed out a sigh that was more relief than I wanted to admit. Of course it was my imagination. I was a 32-year-old man with a middling office job and a mortgage, not a character in a ghost story. Shadows obeyed light, that was physics, but the seed of observation had been planted, and in the sterile soil of my loneliness that year it grew. I began to watch it the way you might watch a pet you suspect is ill. At first the anomalies were small, easily explained. Walking to the bus stop on a crisp autumn morning, the sun low and brilliant at my back, my shadow would stretch out before me, a long dark guide. Sometimes when I stopped at a crosswalk it would take an extra step, its elongated foot sliding over the curb and into the street before snapping back to my heels. I'd chalk it up to the angle of the sun, to the movement of clouds in my office under the relentless fluorescent grids. My shadow was a faint smudged thing pooled directly beneath my chair. Once during an interminable budget meeting I saw it slowly creep an inch or two to the left towards the cooler darker space under the filing cabinet. While I sat perfectly still I didn't move for the rest of the hour, my skin prickling with a cold sweat. The real change began with the rain, a week of it, a relentless gray deluge that turned the city into a reflection of itself. Umbrellas were useless against the wind-driven sheets and I arrived home each evening soaked and shivering. My apartment felt damp, the air heavy, and the light changed. The usual sharp contrasts were gone, replaced by a gloomy even murk. My shadow became less defined, more of a general darkness that clung to me. One such evening I came in, dropped my dripping coat on the back of a chair and flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered, a power surge from the storm, and died with a soft pop, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light came from a street lamp outside, filtered through the rain-streaked window. It cast a faint silvered rectangle on my living room floor. Cursing, I fumbled for a flashlight I kept in a drawer. My fingers closed around the cold metal cylinder. I clicked it on a bright focused beam, cut through the gloom. I pointed it at the floor, intending to find my way to the fuse box. The circle of light landed just in front of my feet and my shadow did not appear where the beam hit the floorboards. There was only light, a clean white disc. The darkness that had been pooled around my shoes simply stayed there. A puddle of black ink untouched by the beam. It refused to enter the circle. I moved the flashlight. The circle slid across the floor, over the leg of the table, up the wall. It chased away every other shadow it touched, but the darkness at my feet remained stubbornly fixed. A personal eclipse. I swung the beam directly onto my shoes. The leather lit up, gleaming wetly, but beneath them the shadow persisted, a perfect, impossible silhouette, unaffected by the light shining right through it. The light was above it. It should have been erased. Instead it seemed to drink the light, becoming even denser, a hole in reality. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered on the floor, the beam spinning wildly before settling, pointing at the wall. In the chaos of light I saw my shadow finally move, not with the bouncing beam but independently, sliding up the wall in a swift liquid motion before dissipating into the general darkness of the room. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I stood there in the semi-dark, the only sound the drumming of rain on the window and the frantic thudding in my ears. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a product of the strange diffused light of my exhaustion of the storm, but I didn't believe it. After that it was a quiet war. I became a student of illumination. I bought stronger bulbs, floor lamps, a desk lamp with an adjustable arm. I filled my apartment with light, banishing every corner to brilliance. It was a futile effort. My shadow no longer obeyed the rules. It had preferences. It hated the new bright LED panels I installed in the kitchen, shivering and contracting into a tight fist size knot under the table when I turned them on, but it loved the old incandescent bulb in my bedside lamp, stretching luxuriously up the wall when I read at night, its edges soft and deep. Most disturbingly, it began to resist following me. I'd walk from the brightly lit kitchen into the softer light of the hallway, and I'd feel a tug, a slight resistance, like walking through shallow water. I'd glance back and my shadow would be lingering at the threshold, slowly, reluctantly bleeding across the line, as if the light in the kitchen was a substance it was loath to leave. The silence in my life became filled with this unspoken tension. I stopped having people over. How could I explain the way I'd nervously adjust lamps, my eyes constantly darting to the floor? How could I sit and have a conversation while a part of me was monitoring the independent, sulking movements of my own darkness? It was mine, and yet it was not. It was a separate, silent tenant in my apartment, one that paid no rent and demanded all my attention. One Tuesday I worked late. The office was empty, a cavern of gray cubicles illuminated only by the exit signs and the ghostly glow of dormant computer screens. I gathered my things and walked to the elevator bank. The overhead lights here were on motion sensors. As I walked they flickered on in sequences. Ahead of me a wave of clinical white light, and off behind me a wave of descending gloom. I reached the main lobby, a vast marble-floored space with a high glass ceiling the night cleaning crew had left on a few strategic lights, creating islands of illumination in a sea of shadow. I walked towards the main doors, my footsteps echoing. I passed under one of the great glass skylights. A half-moon shone through, casting a pale milky rectangle on the floor. I stepped into it and my shadow stayed behind. It simply stopped at the edge of the moonlight, as if it had hit a wall. I was 3 paces into the silvered light before I felt that familiar cold absence. I turned. There it was, 10 feet back, a concentrated pool of blackness sitting just outside the moonbeam. It wasn't my shape, it was just a darkness. We faced each other, me in the light, it in the dark. I could feel it watching me, not with eyes but with a profound gravitational attention. It was waiting. The moonbeam was a barrier it would not cross. I had to go back for it. The thought was humiliating and terrifying. I couldn't leave it there in the corporate lobby. I took a step back towards the darkness as my foot left the moonlight and touched the shadowed marble. The pool at my feet quivered, then flowed forward, merging seamlessly with my legs, becoming my shadow again. The moment it reattached, a deep, sickening chill shot up my spine, a feeling of being weighed down by something cold and heavy. That was the breaking point. I stopped trying to force it into the light. A dreadful compromise settled and I began to arrange my life around its preferences. I took the longer, shadier route to the bus. I started closing the blinds in the afternoon to keep the sun from hitting certain spots on the floor. I replaced the bright hallway bulb with a lower wattage one, creating a dim tunnel it seemed to find acceptable. My apartment became a museum of half-light. I was no longer living in it, I was curating an environment for my shadow. The thing that was supposed to be a passive effect had become the cause. I was following it. Last night the power went out in the whole neighborhood. A transformer blow, according to the text alert. True darkness, the kind you never find in the city, descended. I sat on my sofa, a single candle flickering on the coffee table. Its tiny flame pushed the black back just a few feet, creating a small dome of amber light. I looked down. My shadow was gone, not hidden, not stretched, gone in the candlelight. My body cast a weak dancing shade on the sofa cushions behind me, but at my feet there was nothing, just the faint glow of the floorboards. The darkness that had lived there, that had pooled and resisted and lingered, had retreated into the greater dark of the room. It had returned to its source. I felt a bizarre, profound loneliness. I also felt lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The candle burned lower, the circle of light shrank, and as it did I saw the darkness at the edges of the room begin to stir. It wasn't just an absence. It had texture, a slow viscous movement like oil on water. It began to seep back towards the center of the room, towards me. It didn't rush. It advanced with a terrible patience. The candle flame guttered the darkness, reached the toes of my shoes. I didn't move. I watched as it climbed, covering my feet, my ankles, a rising tide of cool nothingness. It wasn't forming a shadow cast by the light, it was simply reclaiming its place. The candle flickered one last time and went out. I sit here now in the absolute dark. The power is still out. The street outside is silent. I can't see my hand in front of my face, but I can feel it. It's not at my feet anymore, it's everywhere. It's the air I breathe, it's in the quiet thrum of my own blood. The boundary is gone. When the lights come back on, if they come back, only don't know what will be cast upon the wall. I don't know if it will have my shape or if I will simply be a man standing in a room with no darkness to prove he's there at all. The wait is the worst part, the waiting and the slow cold understanding that I am no longer afraid of the dark. I am afraid of the light and what it will reveal. I have become. It started as a walk, just a walk to clear the static from my head. My therapist had suggested it. Get out of the apartment, Noah, anchor yourself in physical space, listen to the city breathe. It was past 11 and the city's breath was a low wet sigh. A fine persistent drizzle had been falling for hours, not heavy enough for an umbrella, just enough to coat everything in a slick shimmering film under the streetlights. My neighborhood was quiet, rows of brownstones sleeping behind black iron fences. The only sounds were the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic drip from overflowing gutters. My own footsteps were muffled, a soft steady crunch on the damp grit of the sidewalk. I was on the block behind my own, a street lined with old sprawling oaks whose roots had long ago buckled and conquered the concrete. The pavement here was a topography of ridges and valleys. I was walking in the middle of the sidewalk, avoiding the deeper pools of shadow under the trees sticking to the islands of jaundiced light from the wrought iron lamps. I was trying to be present, to feel the chill air in my lungs, to note the pattern of rain on my jacket, anything to silence the low-grade anxiety hum that was my default state. That's when I heard it, a scrape, sharp, deliberate, the sound a shoe makes when you drag the sole to stop yourself or change direction. I stopped instantly. The sound had come from my left, from the narrow pitch-black gap between two brownstones, an alleyway just wide enough for trash cans. My head snapped towards the darkness. Nothing, no movement, no shape, just a void. My heart did a quick hard thump against my ribs. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding thin and foolish in the damp air. No answer. The silence felt thicker now, attentive. It was probably a cat, I reasoned, or a piece of loose siding moving in the wind. Though there was no wind, I stood there for a full minute, straining to hear only the relentless drizzle. I shook my head, a physical attempt to dislodge the sudden prickling on my neck, and continued walking. 50 feet later it happened again, scrape, this time from my right, from the foot of one of the great oaks. Its trunk was massive, surrounded by a small circular patch of dirt where the sidewalk had surrendered. The sound came from that dirt, from the deep shadow the street lamp couldn't penetrate. I froze again, my body coiled tight. I stared at the base of the tree. The shadow was absolute. If someone was crouching there, I couldn't see them, but the scrape had been clear, gritty, the sound of something on the granular soil and old leaves. I can hear you, I said louder, this time trying to inject a force. I didn't feel. The shadow under the tree did not move. No one emerged. The longer I looked, the more that patch of darkness seemed to solidify, to become a shoppy, hunched, waiting shape. But it was just my mind painting pictures on the canvas of nothing. I started walking again, faster. Now the therapeutic calm was gone, replaced by a rising tide of primal alertness. My senses were painfully sharp. I could hear the rustle of my own jacket, the squeak of a shoulder seam. I could smell the wet earth and rotting leaves from the tree pits. I rounded the corner onto my own street, a shorter block that deadened at a small fenced-in park that was always locked at dusk. Relief began to warm my chilled blood. My building was halfway down its green awning, a welcome sight. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, my eyes on my feet, on the familiar cracks in the sidewalk. I was 10 steps from my stoop when I heard it a third time, scrape right behind me, so close it could have been at my heel. I whirled around, a gasp caught in my throat. The sidewalk was empty. A long gleaming strip of wet concrete stretched back to the corner, lit by the periodic street lamps. No one, not a single person. No doors had opened, no gates had swung shut. The street was utterly still, but the sound had been immediate. It wasn't from an alley or a tree pit, it was on the pavement right where I had been standing. My eyes scanned the ground, searching for a cowsie, a bottle cap, a piece of broken brick. Nothing, just smooth wet pavement reflecting the lamplight like a dark mirror. I backed up to my building's door, my key stabbing clumsily at the lock until it caught. I fell inside, slamming the heavy door shut and leaning against it, my breath coming in short sharp clouds in the dim foyer. Safe, I was safe. I climbed the stairs. To my second-floor apartment on trembling legs, locking and deadbolting my own door behind me. I poured a drink I didn't want and sat in the dark of my living room listening. The normal sounds of the Buldinga radiator clicking, pipes groaning seemed like code-like signals. I replayed the sound in my head. It wasn't a random noise, it had intention. A scrape, a step from where no one stood. Sleep didn't come. Every time I drifted, I'd jerk awake, convinced I'd heard the sound again, this time from my hardwood hallway. By dawn I was hollowed out, raw. The rational part of my brain, the part that went to therapy and paid taxes, staged a coup. It had been a piece of trash, a wet newspaper dragged by a draft. It had been my own shoe scuffing in a way I hadn't noticed. It was stress manifesting as auditory hypervigilance. I almost believed it. I avoided that block for 3 days. I took different routes, but the memory of the sound festered. It was a splinter in my mind. On the fourth night, clear and cold, I found myself putting on my coat with a grim determination. I needed to prove it was nothing. I needed to walk that block again and hear only normal city sounds. I needed to reclaim it. The night was crystalline, the stars sharp pinpricks in the black above the light pollution. The air was still, no rustle of leaves to provide an excuse. My footsteps were crisp, martial. I approached the first location, the alley between the brownstones. I stopped in front of it, staring into the mouth of the darkness. Okay, I whispered. Do it. Silence. I waited a full 2 minutes. Nothing. A fragile triumph bloomed in my chest. See, imagination. I moved to the second spot, the base of the oak tree. I stood at the edge of the circle of dirt, staring into the knot of shadows at the trunk. Here too I challenged the emptiness. The night held its breath. I let out a long shaky sigh. It was over. I turned to go home, the tension in my shoulders beginning to unwind. I took 3 steps, and from directly behind me, from the spot on the sidewalk I had just vacated, came the scrape. Not loud but precise, a single declarative statement. My blood turned to ice. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The logic I had clung to shattered. This was not coincidence. This was not a cat or a piece of trash. It was a response. It was following my route, my pauses. It was waiting for me to move so it could occupy the space I had left. The silence that followed the scrape was the most terrifying part. It wasn't the silence of an empty street. It was the silence of something listening, something poised. I didn't run. Running felt like an invitation, an acknowledgement of a chase. I walked, every muscle in my back clenched, expecting the sound to come again at my heel. It didn't. It let me walk all the way to my door. It was hurting me. Life became a prison of careful movement. I stopped going out after dark, but the scrape didn't need me outside. I first heard it inside my apartment. A week later I was in the kitchen, making tea. The kettle had just begun its low whistle when I heard it clear as day from the tiled floor of the hallway behind me. A slow, drawn-out scrape. I dropped the mug. It shattered on the floor, porcelain shards skittering across the tile, echoing the sound in my mind. I stood paralyzed, staring at the empty hallway. It was in here with me. It had followed me home. Now it has a rhythm. It's learning me. It happens when I'm still, when the apartment is quiet. It comes from the next room, always the next room. From the bathroom floor, when I'm lying in bed staring at the ceiling, from just inside the living room when I'm washing dishes. It never comes from where I am, it comes from where I was or where I am about to be. It's mapping my absence. I've tried everything. I've ripped up the rugs thinking maybe it was a floorboard contracting. I've had the pipes inspected. I've played white noise constantly, a roaring fan, loud podcasts, but in the lulls, in the moments between tracks, or when the fan cycles to a lower setting, it finds a gap, a single gritty scrape. It's gotten softer, more intimate, as if it doesn't need to be loud anymore because it's so close. Last night I tried an experiment. I sat in the center of my living room, all lights off, in complete silence. I held my breath. I waited. An hour passed. Nothing. My body began to ache from the stillness. Just as I thought I might have finally broken the cycle, I felt an overwhelming urge to look towards my apartment door. I turned my head slowly, and in the perfect darkness I heard it, not from the hallway, not from the next room scrape. It came from the other side of the couch, from the space where if I were sitting there my feet would be resting on the floor. It was keeping me company. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat in the dark, listening to the echo of the sound that wasn't mine, feeling the presence of the step that was never taken. The worst part isn't the fear anymore. It's the loneliness. It's the certainty that I am sharing my life with a footprint that has no foot, a movement that has no body, a companion that exists only in the negative space I leave behind. And I know with a cold and quiet dread that one night I will hear the scrape, not from beside me or behind me, but from directly in front of me. And on that night I will have finally met it, and there will be nowhere left for me to stand. The first time it happened I was drunk, not sloppy stumbling drunk, but the quiet melancholy kind that settles in after a party has died, when the empty bottles gleam in the lamplight and the laughter is just a ghost in the walls. My girlfriend Alara had gone to bed an hour before, pleading a migraine. I stayed on the sofa nursing the last of a scotch, scrolling through my phone without seeing anything. The apartment was ours, a newly rented duplex with tall bare walls we hadn't gotten around to Decorating at night with the overhead lights off and only the floor lamp in the corner burning, those walls became vast pale canvases. I saw her silhouette on the wall opposite the hallway to our bedroom. It was a perfect black cutout, sharp as a paper doll thrown by the light from our slightly ajar bedroom door. She was standing still, her profile clear, the straight line of her nose, the gentle curve of her lips, the fall of her hair over one shoulder. She must have gotten up to get a glass of water. I thought I was about to call out to ask if her head was any better when the silhouette moved. It didn't step, it slid, it glided horizontally along the wall from the edge of the doorframe towards the living room archway as if she were on a silent track. The motion was smooth, utterly unnatural. A human walk is a series of rises and falls, a bobbling transfer of weight. This was a translation, a shape shifting its coordinates without altering its form. It stopped just before the archway. I stared, the Scotch glass cold in my hand. The silhouette was still again, perfectly still. Then slowly the head turned, not a human turn of the neck, but the entire profile pivoting on a central axis to face directly out into the living room towards where I sat. In the dim light it held that impossible forward-facing profile for 3 long seconds, then it slid back the way it came, disappearing into the slash of light from the bedroom door. My heart was thudding dully. "Alara." I called, my voice hoarse. No answer. I got up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the bedroom. The door was ajar just as I'd seen. Pale moonlight filtered through the blinds. She was in bed, asleep, her back to me, the covers rising and falling with her slow, even breath. She looked peaceful. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching her, then looking back at the empty moon-washed wall in the hallway. The Scotch, I decided it was the Scotch and the late hour and the play of shadows. I crept into bed, careful not to wake her, and lay staring at the ceiling until the gray light of dawn bleached the room. I forgot about it, or I forced myself to forget. Life resumed its normal rhythm. We hung art on the wall, so large abstract print in the living room, a vintage movie poster in the hall. The blank canvases were gone, and with them I thought the opportunity for my drunken mind to play tricks. Alara was her usual self, quiet, a little distant sometimes, prone to those headaches that sent her to bed early. She loved the apartment. She said she loved the light. She was always adjusting the blinds, creating specific slants and pools of sunlight, or arranging the lamps in the evening to avoid what she called the glare. The second time I was sober, it was a Tuesday evening. She was reading in the armchair by the floor lamp, a book propped in her lap. I was at the dining table paying bills. The lamp behind her cast her shadow hugely across the abstract print on the opposite wall. It distorted her shape, blending with the colorful splotches of the art, but the outline of her head and shoulders was distinct. I glanced up from a utility statement, my eyes grazing the wall, and I saw it, the shadow head tilted not in sync with her movement. She was perfectly still, absorbed in her book, but on the wall the silhouette of her head tilted slowly to the left as if considering something. Then it righted itself. I froze, my pen hovering over the check. I watched her, then the shadow. They were disconnected. She turned a page, a small crisp motion on the wall. Her shadow arm made a slow arcing movement like a conductor leading a silent orchestra before settling back. "Did you see that?" I said the words out before I could stop them. She looked up, blinking. "See what on the wall?" "Your shadow." It moved. She followed my gaze to the wall, then looked back at me, a faint confused smile on her lips. "Moved? It's a shadow, Leo. It moves when I move." She lifted her hand and waved, and her shadow on the wall waved back, a perfect synchronous pantomime. "See, I did see now." It was normal. I forced a laugh, rubbing my eyes. "Sorry, long day. My eyes are crossing over these numbers." She gave me a sympathetic look and returned to her book, but for the rest of the evening I watched, and it was normal. It was only ever normal when she knew I was watching. The incidents were never dramatic, never monstrous. They were subtle violations of physics, quiet mutinies of light and form. I'd see it from the corner of my eye. Her silhouette on the kitchen wall, standing by the window, would slowly raise a shadow hand to its shadow face in a gesture of contemplation, while Alara at the sink scrubbed a pot, her real hands busy and downward. I'd walk past the bathroom at night, the door cracked, the exhaust fan light casting her profile on the steam-streaked wall as she brushed her teeth. In the mirror's reflection I could see her moving the brush in short vertical strokes on the wall. The silhouette's head would shake slowly side to side, a mournful negative gesture. It was like watching a silent film of her mood, a secret performance meant for the walls alone. I started to dread the evenings, the play of lamplight. I bought brighter bulbs, trying to flood the spaces, to dissolve shadows into nothing. She complained, "It's so harsh, Leo. It's like living in a hospital shed. Turn them off and light candles instead," creating a world of soft dancing shadows where her silhouette could writhe and stretch on every surface. I took to sitting in the dark, the blue glow of my laptop the only light on my face, so I wouldn't have to see it, but I could feel it. The space around us felt charged, a stage waiting for its silent actor. I began to document it, not consciously at first. I'd find myself positioning my phone on A shelf pretending to charge at the camera pointed at a wall where I anticipated an incident. The footage was always murky, poorly lit, but in a few clips if you strained you could see at the disconnect the shadow arm lifting while her body remained still, the slow independent turn of the shadow head. I showed one clip to a friend, a guy who worked in video editing. I played it off as a weird glitch, a trick of the light. He squinted at the screen. Weird, he said, looks like a lag in the frame rate or something. Your lighting in that place is crap, man. He saw a technical flaw, not a metaphysical one. Confrontation was impossible. What would I say? Your shadow is alive. Shed think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. The lack of sleep was carving hollows under my eyes. I jumped at every shift in light. Our conversations became strained, orbiting this terrible unspeakable secret. She asked me often if I was okay. I'd say I was stressed about work. The truth was a boulder on my tongue. The climax was slow, not sudden. It was a Tuesday again. Rain tapped against the windows. We were on the sofa watching a movie, a throw of blankets over us. The only light was from the television, flickering images of actors and landscapes that cast a transient chaotic glow. I felt her shadow beside me, thrown on the wall behind the sofa by the TV's light. I couldn't see it directly, but I was hyper aware of its presence on screen. A car chase erupted, a strobing frenzy of headlights and explosions. The light in the room became a frantic pulse, and beside me on the wall her silhouette began to convulse. It wasn't mimicking the movie, it was having a seizure of its own. It jerked, elongated, compressed, its edges fraying and reforming. It peeled itself away from the contour of her real body, swelling into a monstrous amoebic shape that loomed over the sofa, then shrinking into a dense black puddle. It was free in the strobing light. It was completely, terrifyingly free of her. I tore my eyes from the wall and looked at Alara. She was staring straight ahead at the screen, her face a placid mask reflected in the colored light, but a single tear traced a clean line down her cheek. She wasn't reacting to the movie, she was weeping silently, steadily, as her shadow raged on the wall behind her. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. The movie crashed to its climax. The final scene was quiet, a sunrise over a calm sea. The room light stabilized into a soft golden glow. The silhouette on the wall slid softly back into its proper place, aligning perfectly with her seated form. It was just a shadow again. The tear on her cheek had dried. She sniffed softly, wiped her nose with the back of her hand, and looked at me. Good movie, she said, her voice thick. That was the last night I saw it happen. It was as if the outburst had exhausted the phenomenon or fulfilled its purpose. Her shadow now behaves impeccably. It follows her with dog-like fidelity. The apartment feels lighter somehow, but something else has taken its place. A silence, not an empty silence, but a full, pregnant one. Alara moves through the rooms with a new stillness, as if she is consciously coordinating with her now obedient shade. She stands for long minutes at the windows, not looking out but looking at her own reflection or the shadow it casts. She has started dressing in darker colors which produce deeper, more defined shadows. She has taken down the abstract print from the living room wall, leaving it bare once more, a vast pale canvas. Last night I woke up, the digital clock read 3:14 a.m. The room was black. Alara's breathing beside me was deep and even, and I realized I could see the wall opposite our bed. A sliver of light from a street lamp outside fell across it, a narrow vertical stripe, and in that stripe I saw her silhouette standing facing me. It was perfectly still. I held my breath, listening. Her breathing next to me never changed. She was asleep, but her shadow was awake, and it was watching me from its lit wall. I closed my eyes, pretending sleep, and when I dared to open them minutes later, the stripe of light was empty. The silhouette had gone back to its source, or perhaps it had simply stepped out of the light into the greater darkness of the room where it could move without any wall to define it. I lie here now next to her in the quiet dark, and I understand the horror was never that her silhouette moved. The horror is that it has stopped moving where I can see it. It has learned to behave, and now I have no way of knowing where it is or what it is doing when the lights are out. I only know that it is no longer truly hers, and somewhere in the dark spaces of this house we share it is practicing. The panic didn't start as a scream, it started as a hum, a low-frequency vibration in the bones. A tuning fork struck against the reality of a closing door. The man was just a shape in the alley, mouth backlit by a distant sodium vapor light, but his stillness was all wrong. People don't stand that still. I'd been walking fast, head down, the kind of late-night hurry that speaks of a destination you don't really have. My apartment was 3 blocks away. The shortcut through the old textile district was a mistake I'd promised myself I wouldn't make again, but the rain had started, a cold needling drizzle, and the covered walkways between the decaying brick factories offered a few hundred feet of shelter. I saw him and my pace hitched. I veered slightly, a subconscious correction, aiming for the opposite curb, my shadow thrown ahead of me by a lone security light on a pole stretched long and thin across the wet asphalt, a black arrow pointing directly at his feet. He didn't move. I kept walking, my heart beginning to Drum a quick stupid rhythm against my ribs. Rule 1: don't run. Running is an admission, an invitation. Just walk fast, purposeful. I was parallel to him now, close enough to hear the drip of water from a broken gutter. I didn't look, I kept my eyes locked on the next island of light 50 yards ahead. My shadow was beside me now, a distorted companion on the rough brick wall to my left, and then from the alley mouth I heard the scrape of a shoe, a single deliberate step onto the sidewalk. That was all it took. The hum became a shriek in my nervous system. Run. My muscles coiled and unleashed. I pushed off a surge of pure adrenaline, legs driving hard against the ground, or they tried to. The first stride was normal, the second was an agony. It felt like trying to sprint through waist-deep tar. My forward momentum choked off my body, jerking as if yanked backwards by a rope around my waist. I stumbled, my feet tangling, and I fell hard. My palms skidded on the gritty wet pavement, the burn immediate and sharp. I scrambled to my knees, whimpering, expecting a hand on my collar, the cold press of steel. Nothing. I looked back. The man was still in the alley mouth. He hadn't moved, he was just watching. But that wasn't what stopped the air in my lungs. My shadow. It wasn't with me. I was on my knees, but my shadow was still standing. It was upright in the exact spot on the wall where I had been when I decided to run. It was planted, and from its feet, dark tendrils like roots or veins spread out across the brick and the pavement, gripping the mortar lines, seeping into the cracks. It was anchored. I was trying to flee, but my shadow was holding its ground, and it was holding me. A sound escaped me, a thin, wet gasp. I pushed myself up, ignoring the sting in my hands. I turned away from the man, from my own stuck darkness, and I pulled. It was a physical effort, like dragging a sled loaded with stone. Every muscle in my legs and back strained. I managed a step. A horrible tearing sensation shot up my spine, as if I were ripping Velcro loose from my very core. On the wall the shadows formed, distorted, stretching like taffy, but its feet remained rooted, those dark roots digging in deeper. I took another step, another rip. I could hear it, a sound that wasn't a sound, a low groaning tear in the fabric of something invisible. I didn't look back at the man again. He was irrelevant now. The true predator was my own absence of light. I lurched forward in a grotesque hobbling run, each step a monumental fight against the anchor in my shadow. The world narrowed to the screaming protest of my muscles, and that relentless static dragged. The safety of the next streetlight seemed a continent away. I focused on it, a yellow halo in the rain-streaked dark. Just get to the light, different shadow. Maybe it would reset. I was 10 feet from the edge of its glow. My breath was sobbing in my throat. 5 feet. I put everything I had into a final desperate lunge, throwing myself into the circle of light as if diving into water. The effect was instant. The tearing sensation vanished, the anchor released. I sprawled onto the pavement again, inside the pool of light. Gasping, I rolled onto my back, staring up at the rain swirling in the lamp's aura. I was free. I fumbled to my knees and looked back down the street towards the alley. The man was gone, and my shadow, it was lying on the ground halfway between me and where it had been rooted. It was disconnected, a flat black stain on the wet pavement. It wasn't attached to my feet, it just was. As I watched, it began to slide slowly with a horrible liquid grace. It slithered across the asphalt, following the path I had torn, moving back towards me, not snapping back, not rejoining. It was catching up. I couldn't be here when it arrived. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and ran properly. This time my legs obeyed. I didn't look back. I ran the last 2 blocks to my apartment building, slammed through the door, took the stairs 2 at a time, and locked myself inside. I stood in my dark hallway, panting, listening. No pursuit, just the hum of the refrigerator, the tap of rain on the window. I flipped the light switch, the overhead fixture came on. I looked down, dread, a cold stone in my stomach. My shadow pooled neatly at my feet, normal attached. It moved. When I wiggled my toes, I let out a shuddering breath that was half a sob. It was over. It was a trick of the light, a panic attack, a hallucination. Born of fear, I repeated it to myself as I washed the gravel from my palms, as I changed into dry clothes. It wasn't real. The mind plays tricks. The shadow on the floor followed me faithfully from room to room, but it felt different. It felt heavy, not as a visual weight but as a sensation. Walking to the kitchen felt like waiting. My steps were slower, more deliberate. I told myself it was the adrenaline crash, the shock. I made tea, my hands shaking. I sat at the small table. The light was above me, casting my shadow compactly beneath the chair. I lifted the cup to my lips, and I felt a resistance, a gentle, firm tug downwards, as if my shadow had hooked a finger through the handle of its own shadow cup and was holding it down. I set the cup down, staring at the simple dark shape under the table. It was perfectly still. I went to bed, leaving every light in the apartment blazing. Sleep was impossible. I lay there, hyper-aware of the darkness that must be clinging to the underside of my body, pressed between me and the mattress, a darkness that was now a thing with properties, with will, with grip. The next day was overcast, a flat gray light that cast weak, diffuse shadows. I moved through my Sunday routine with a leaden feeling. Every action required a slight extra effort. Opening a drawer, lifting my arm to check my watch. It was subtle, but it was constant, a low-grade friction against the world. I went for a walk in the afternoon. Desperate for a sense of normalcy in the flat light, my shadow was a faint soft smudge around my feet. I stopped at a crosswalk. The light was red. I stood waiting and I felt it settle like a weight sinking into mud. My shadow was seeping into the concrete, spreading its roots. I tried to shift my weight from one foot to the other. It was difficult. I was stuck. The light turned green. People brushed past me. I willed my leg to lift. It was a Herculean effort. A deep internal rip. I took a step and the sucking release was audible in my own ears. I didn't continue the walk. I turned and lumbered home, each step a battle against the increasing gravity of my own silhouette. It's been 3 days. I haven't left the apartment. The drag is worse indoors. I move from room to room in a slow, painful shuffle. My shadow has developed preferences. It loves the textured rug in the living room, clinging to its fibers with 1,000 tiny hooks. It hates the smooth linoleum of the kitchen, sliding reluctantly, making my progress there slightly easier, but only slightly. It is learning the geography of my home and it is finding places to dig in. Worst of all, it is beginning to act before I do. This morning I went to the window to look outside. As I approached, my shadow stretched towards the wall beneath the sill. Before I even decided to stop, I felt the anchor set. It had predicted my destination and rooted itself so that when I arrived I was already held. I stood at the window for an hour, unable to will my feet to move, staring out at the world I can no longer navigate. I am a prisoner of my own shape. I am sitting now. It is the only thing I can do with any ease. Sitting concentrates my shadow into a small dense pool. Standing is a war. Walking is a myth. I think about the man in the alley. I don't think he was a threat at all. I think he was a warning, or perhaps he was someone else who had gotten away, and what I saw was not menace but recognition. A recognition of the same anchor, the same grip. The light is fading. Evening is coming soon. I will have to turn on the lamps. I don't know if I will be able to get up from this chair to do so. My shadow is pooling around the chair, legs deepening, thickening. It is not just under me anymore. It is creeping up the legs of the chair, a slow rising tide of tar. I can feel its cold, insistent pressure against the soles of my feet, my ankles. It is not content to simply hold me down anymore. It is beginning to climb, and I have nowhere left to run. Even if I could, my shadow has already proven it will not follow. It will simply grip the ground and let me tear myself apart, trying to leave it behind. The terrible quiet truth settles in. I am not being held captive. I am being reclaimed. The part of me that the light cannot touch is calling the rest of me home to a permanent silent stillness, and it is winning. It began with a headache, one of those deep orbital aches that feels less like pain and more like a pressure change inside your skull. I'd been staring at a spreadsheet for 6 hours straight, the blue light of the monitor bleaching the color from the world. When I finally leaned back, rolling the stiffness from my neck, the office was empty. The cleaning crew's vacuum hummed somewhere in the distant halls. My own reflection in the dark monitor was a ghostly smudge, a pale oval floating in the void of the screen. I rubbed my eyes, the heels of my palms pressing into the sockets until I saw swirling colors. When I looked back at the screen, the ghost was still there, but the details were wrong. The shape of the head, the set of the shoulders. It wasn't my slouch, it was someone else's posture. I blinked hard, my reflection resolved. Of course it was me, tired, strained, but me. I shut down the computer, the room plunging into near darkness save for the emergency exit signs, bloody glow gathering my things. I caught my profile in the glass of a framed corporate mission statement on the wall, sharp nose, weak chin, the familiar arc of my eyebrow. I lingered for a second, the face so known it was invisible to me. Then I turned out the light and left. The subway platform was its usual tomb of fluorescent light and slow dripping silence. It was late and the crowd was thin, scattered islands of people avoiding each other's eyes. I stood behind the yellow line, listening to the distant growing rumble of the approaching train. The wind from the tunnel pushed against my face, bringing the smell of ozone and damp concrete. I glanced down at the tracks, at the litter skittering in the draft, and in the polished stainless steel curve of the safety panel below the platform edge. I saw a reflection, not of the ceiling, not of the posters behind me, a face in profile looking down the tunnel. It was a man, late 40s maybe. A strong straight nose. I didn't have a jawline, with a hint of stubble squared where mine was rounded, thick dark hair swept back from a high forehead. A complete stranger. He was frowning, slightly intent on the dark tunnel, as if willing the train to appear. My breath caught. I was the only one standing near this section of the panel. The reflection had to be mine, but it wasn't. I turned my head slightly to the left, testing in the steel. The stranger's profile turned in perfect sync. I raised a hand to my cheek, the reflection's hand, paler, longer fingered than mine, rose and touched its jaw, a perfect mirror, but of the wrong man. A wave of vertigo hit me, a lurching sense of dislocation so profound I had to step back from the edge. The train roared into the station, brakes screaming, drowning my panic in noise and light. The doors slid open. I stumbled in, collapsing into a seat, my eyes fixed on my own hands in my lap. My hands, I knew these hands, the small scar on the knuckle from a childhood bike accident, the Bitten cuticle on my left thumb. They were mine. I looked up, seeking my reflection in the dark window across the aisle. The interior lights of the car were bright, turning the window into a weak mirror. I could see the shape of my head, the color of my jacket, but the features were blurred, smeared by the speed and the lights of the stations flashing by. I couldn't make out the face. I got off at my stop, a station early, needing air, needing to walk. The rain had started, a fine cold mist that beaded on my skin. I passed the darkened windows of closed shops. In each one a shape moved with me, a dark silhouette. The proportions were off, taller, broader. I'd stop and the silhouette would stop. I'd raise a hand and a longer, darker arm would lift in the glass, but the details, the face, they were just shadows erased by the night and the interior darkness of the shops. At home I went straight to the bathroom. I flicked on the light, the harsh, unforgiving bulbs around the mirror blazing to life. I stood before it, gripping the sides of the sink, and I looked. It was me, exhausted, pale, eyes wide with a fear I could now name, but it was me. My nose, my lips, the faint worry line between my brows. I let out a shuddering sigh, my forehead touching the cool glass. A hallucination, stress, the headache, a trick of the light on the subway steel. I recited the reasons like a mantra. I took a long shower, the steam fogging the mirror, erasing everything. The next morning, shaving, the steam had cleared. I lathered my face, the citrus smell of the cream familiar and comforting. I picked up the razor and met my own eyes in the mirror as I brought the blade to my cheek, and my reflection winked, not a playful familiar wink, a slow deliberate closing of one eye, the left while the right. I held mine with a flat knowing stare, the side of its mouth. My mouth quirked in a smirk I had never worn. I jerked back the razor, nicking my jaw. A bead of blood welled hot and startling in the mirror. The stranger with my face watched the blood trace a path down his neck, his expression one of mild detached interest. Then he raised his own hand, the one not holding the spectral razor, and touched his own jaw where I was bleeding. He brought his fingertips away, looked at them, then looked back at me and smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile. It was utterly horrifying. I backed out of the bathroom. I called in sick. I spent the day in the living room, away from any reflective surface, but they are everywhere. The black screen of the turned-off television, the glass cover of a picture frame, the side of the kettle. I moved through the apartment like a thief, avoiding angles, keeping my head down, but I could feel him, a presence, a parallel identity occupying the same space, only visible in the silvered world behind glass and polished metal. That afternoon, desperate for proof, I did something reckless. I set up my phone on a shelf, pointed at the blank TV screen. I started a video recording. I walked into the frame, stood before the dark reflective glass, and slowly turned my head from side to side. I held up my hands. I mouthed the words, "Who are you?" Then I stopped the recording, my heart hammering. I played it back on the small screen. I saw myself from behind, a man standing in a room. I saw the dark rectangle of the TV, but my reflection in it was just a murky, inverted shape, a blur of motion. The phone's camera couldn't capture it. It couldn't see what I saw. The evidence was for my eyes only, a private haunting. The silence in the apartment became a dialogue. I would think a thought. I should make coffee, and in the reflection of the toaster I would see the stranger's profile, give a slight approving nod. I would feel a pang of regret about an old argument, and in the window his face would cloud with a sadness that felt deeper, more worn than my own. He was not just mimicking me, he was reacting. He was a separate consciousness riding the other side of the mirror. I stopped looking in mirrors, but it didn't matter. I began to know what he looked like without seeing him. I could feel the stronger jaw, the set of his different shoulders. When I rubbed my tired eyes, I felt the different bone structure of his socket beneath my fingertips. My own face began to feel like a mask, ill-fitting and strange. My voice, when I dared to speak aloud to test it, sounded thin and reedy in my ears. I imagined his voice would be deeper, calmer. The final surrender happened last night. I was lying in bed, the room dark. I had covered the mirror with a sheet, but the moon was full and it cast a bright square of light on the wall opposite my bedroom door. It hates the smooth linoleum of the kitchen, sliding reluctantly, making my progress there slightly easier, but only slightly. It is learning the geography of my home, and it is finding places to dig in. Worst of all, it is beginning to act before I do. This morning I went to the window to look outside. As I approached, my shadow stretched towards the wall beneath the sill. Before I even decided to stop, I felt the anchor set. It had predicted my destination and rooted itself so that when I arrived I was already held. I stood at the window for an hour, unable to will my feet to move, staring out at the world I can no longer navigate. I am a prisoner of my own shape. I am sitting now. It is the only thing I can do with any ease. Sitting concentrates my shadow into a small dense pool. Standing is a war, walking is a myth. I think about the man in the alley. I don't think he was a threat at all. I think he was a warning, or perhaps he was someone else who had gotten away, and what I saw was not menace but Recognition, a recognition of the same anchor, the same grip. The light is fading, evening is coming soon. I will have to turn on the lamps. I don't know if I will be able to get up from this chair to do so. My shadow is pooling around the chair legs, deepening, thickening. It is not just under me anymore, it is creeping up the legs of the chair, a slow rising tide of tar. I can feel its cold insistent pressure against the soles of my feet, my ankles. It is not content to simply hold me down anymore, it is beginning to climb, and I have nowhere left to run. Even if I could, my shadow has already proven it will not follow. It will simply grip the ground and let me tear myself apart, trying to leave it behind. The terrible quiet truth settles in. I am not being held captive, I am being reclaimed. The part of me that the light cannot touch is calling the rest of me home to a permanent silent stillness, and it is winning. It wasn't the main shortcut that was 2 blocks over a well-lit passage between a bakery and a bookstore that people used during the day. This was the other one, the one you took when you were feeling brave or stupid or just utterly sick of the same route home from the same late shift at the call center. A narrow throat of cracked asphalt between the blank windowless brick backs of an old furniture warehouse and a self-storage facility. No lights, no dumpsters, even just walls converging into a perfect geometric void. ID glanced down it 100 times from the safety of the street lamp at its mouth, always deciding against it. But that night the rain was a cold horizontal sleet needling my face, and the thought of adding 5 more minutes to my walk was unbearable. I stood under the lamp, the cone of its light feeling flimsy against the weather, and stared into the alley's absolute black. Just 50 yards, I told myself. I could see the faint sodium glow of the next street at the far end, a tunnel, a wet dark tunnel. I took a breath, hunched my shoulders, and stepped out of the light. The transition was physical. The sleet sound changed, no longer hissing on the pavement around me but drumming on something high, UPA roof maybe, or a fire escape. The world became a narrow corridor of noise and wet and profound consuming darkness. I fumbled for my phone, thumbed the screen to life. The weak LED flashlight barely carved out a shaky circle 3 feet ahead, illuminating streaming rain and glistening black asphalt. It made the darkness around it feel thicker, more aggressive. I started walking fast, my shoes making wet slapping sounds that echoed off the close walls. 10 steps and the feeling began. It was a pressure not on my skin but on my sense of space. The alley was 8 feet wide at most, but it began to feel occupied, not like someone was following me. Worse, it felt like the space itself was full, like I was walking not through an empty passage but through a dense invisible crowd. I couldn't see them, couldn't hear them over the rain, but I could feel the displacement of air, the subtle blockage of sound. My own footsteps, which should have echoed cleanly, came back muffled, absorbed, as if there were bodies soaking up the noise. I stopped, holding my breath. The sleet drummed, and in that drumming I heard or felt the faint, syncopated rhythm of other breaths. Not one, many shallow, patient, waiting breaths. My heart began a frantic tattoo against my ribs. It's the wind, I thought desperately. It's the rain and the downspouts. I lifted my phone, sweeping the feeble light in a wild arc. The beam slid over wet brick, a scribble of graffiti, a dark seam where wall met ground. Nothing, no shapes, no eyes reflecting back, just blackness that drank the light whole after a few feet. But the feeling of presence intensified. It felt like shoulders brushing against mine, though nothing touched me. It felt like standing in a packed elevator surrounded by the warmth and silence of strangers, except there was no warmth, only a penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the sleet. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of damp concrete and something else, something dry and old, like forgotten books in a closed room. I couldn't go back. The thought of turning around, of presenting my back to that crowded, watchful darkness was more terrifying than moving forward. I had to reach the light at the other end. I forced my legs to move. Each step was a negotiation with space that didn't want to yield. I had to angle my shoulders as if sidling past people in a tight queue. My outstretched hand holding the phone kept bumping into nothing, a firm yielding resistance that vanished the moment I focused on it. I heard a sigh so close it could have been by my ear. A weary, resigned exhalation. I jerked away, my back hitting the cold, wet brick wall. I pressed against it, the phone light trembling over the empty space before me, empty yet teeming. Hello. My voice was a thin, cracked thing swallowed instantly by the hungry dark and the rain. No answer, but the pressure shifted. They were moving around me, not to block me but adjusting, making room while still maintaining their impossible density. I could feel the currents of their movement, the slight eddies in the dead air. This was their place. I was the interloper squeezing through their eternal silent congregation. The light at the far end seemed no closer. If anything, it seemed to recede, a tiny tapering rectangle of sickly yellow. The alley felt longer, deeper than 50 yards. It felt infinite. Panic began as a sharp chemical taste in the back of my throat. I started to run, or I tried to. It was like running in a dream through deep water. My legs pumped, but my progress was agonizingly slow. The feeling of bodies was Everywhere now a solid mass I had to fight through. Invisible hands seemed to press against my chest, my back not pushing, just present, holding me in a gentle inescapable embrace of a crowd. I couldn't breathe, the air was thick with their unused breath. I stumbled, my knee hitting the wet asphalt, the phone flew from my hand, clattering and skittering, its light spinning crazy cartwheels before going dark as it hit a puddle. Blackness, absolute perfect, suffocating blackness. I was on my hands and knees in the pitch in the middle of them. I could feel them all around me, above me, a silent patient audience to my collapse. I squeezed my eyes shut, which was no different from keeping them open. The sound of the rain was gone, there was only the sound of my own ragged sobbing breaths and the overwhelming palpable sense of being surrounded, studied by a multitude that had no form. I don't know how long I knelt there, time lost meaning in that static crowded dark. But eventually a different instinct surfaced, one below terror, surrender. I stopped fighting the pressure, I stopped trying to move forward or back, I simply knelt, head bowed in the midst of them, and as I did the pressure changed. It wasn't less, but it was different. The sense of being jostled faded, it became more like being held in place, a single still point in a still crowd. The feeling of breath on my neck subsided slowly. Carefully I opened my eyes. The darkness was still total, but the far end light was there again, exactly where it should be, not 50 yards but maybe 20. It had never moved. I pushed myself up, the crowd parted, not with movement but with a sudden absence of resistance, in a specific path. A narrow lane just wide enough for me opened in the felt crowd, leading directly to the light. It was an invitation or a dismissal. I walked, I didn't run, I walked slowly, stiffly down that narrow corridor of non-resistance. I could still feel the press of them on either side, a wall of unseen presence, but the path was clear. I didn't look left or right, I kept my eyes on the glowing rectangle. Step by step the quality of the darkness began to thin, the smell of old paper faded, the muffling effect on sound lessened, and the drum of the sleet returned. After what felt like an age I stepped out of the alley mouth and onto the wet gleaming sidewalk of the next street. A working street lamp hummed overhead, the sleet stung my face. Normal, terrible, wonderful weather. I turned around. The alley was just a black slit between buildings, empty, quiet, just rain falling into darkness. The feeling of being watched by 1,000 eyes was gone, but the memory of the crowd, of the press of unseen bodies, was etched into my nerves, into the very memory of my skin. I never took that shortcut again. I go the long way through the well-lit paths, even in the sun, but sometimes on the quietest nights when I'm lying in bed and the house settles into its own brand of silence, I feel it again, not the fear but the pressure, the sense that the empty space around my bed and the corners of my room and the hallway is not empty at all, that it is occupied patiently by a presence that has no shape, no breath, no desire except to be. And I know with a cold certainty that the alley was not a unique place, it was a tear in the fabric, a place where they congregate a little more densely, but they are everywhere. The world is not mostly empty space, it is mostly them. We are the ones squeezing through, unaware in the narrow lanes they leave for us, and on the quietest nights when the light feels thin, I can feel them adjusting around me, making room, their silent crowded eternity pressing in from all sides.